This is my 9th video on my attempts to construct a small OO gauge layout. See part 1 for my reasons for doing this, and my lengthy series on my N-gauge railway modelling for more interesting stuff with trains actually running, etc. This part deals with my build of the Superquick Signal Box Coal Order Office and Huts kit. This was the first Superquick kit I had worked on, so it was something of an experiment. My impression was that the Superquick card kits were reasonably sophisticated, not quite as complex and highly worked out as the Metcalfe kits, but a distinct step up from the very basic card kits such as Built Easy or Builder Plus. The prices reflect this, being, for me at least, about half the price of Metcalfe kits. You'll see as we look at this build how I found this first Superquick kit. This is what the kit contained. One fold-out sheet of printed card parts, 2 smaller sheets of printed paper parts, 1 sheet of acetate glazing parts, 2 cast plastic parts for the stairs, and 1 sheet of instructions, plus a warranty card. These contents immediately confirmed my initial expectations, generally quite a bit simpler than a Metcalfe kit, but quite well produced and with some interesting features. The instructions were a little terse, and I found that I sometimes had to read them several times and examine the parts carefully in order to figure out what was intended. This is the main part for the signal box itself, quite well printed and well stamped from the card, and well thought out in terms of assembly, but without some of the extra features that raise Metcalfe kits to a higher level, such as heavy card reinforcers and shapers, and multi-layered inserts for windows and doors, giving a more 3D effect. Here I have fitted the glazing pieces to the main walls. The presentation of the glazing pieces was one of my main criticisms of this kit. The pieces were printed needlessly close together, with effectively tiny borders round each actual window, making it very hard to glue the glazing to the card wall without getting glue onto the windows themselves. I really can't imagine that making the glazing sheet an inch or so larger each way and printing the windows a bit further apart would have added significantly to the cost of producing the kit, and it would certainly have made fitting the windows successfully way easier. You can see here that where possible I've left some extra acetate sheet attached to the windows to make it easier to glue them in place, but the extremely cramped printing of the glazing on the acetate meant that this was simply impossible for some pieces. In the absence of heavy card reinforcers, the kit relied on folding tabs to give some reinforcement to the parts. This was important as the parts did tend to warp quite severely when they came out of the card, and the folding tabs helped to straighten the parts out. Note that the bottom tabs, rather than being folded over, are set at right angles to the walls using small card supports. Next, an intermediate floor is strengthened and straightened with a folding tab, and then the walls are folded round this floor. I did find that the floor would not quite fit into the groove in the tab that was provided for it. And in order to get proper assembly, I needed to cut out an extension to the groove in the tab, as seen at centre right here. So now the basic building has been formed by gluing the walls round the floor. The lower section of the front wall tended to warp, but could be fixed better in place by gluing the top of it to the bottom of the floor tab. Next, the back wall is made up. This was definitely one of the cases where I had to read the instructions twice and look carefully at the part to get it right. Again, folding tabs strengthen and straighten the part, and a paper part glues on to give an inner facing. The back wall is then glued in place. I didn't quite understand why there was a protruding tab in the middle of the back of the floor. This tended to force the back wall to form a curve. Next, a folded card beam is glued across between the walls to help keep them parallel and correctly spaced. Then another folded beam goes across from end to form a ridge for the roof. Next, the platform is glued round the front of the box where the walls are stepped. Up until this point, the build had mainly worked with well-formed card parts, which apart from a couple of minor adjustments went together well. My biggest issue up until here had been getting the glazing glued in place without getting glue onto the visible parts. At this point, you are expected to take the paper part seen here, and this is paper not card, and cut it up to make a bunch of little brackets to support the platform. I wasn't too happy with this. It's generally more difficult to produce good results working with paper parts as opposed to card. For these brackets, the paper was folded double and then glued into place. There was also no indication precisely where these brackets should go, so you had to sort of space them out yourself by eye in some way that looked sensible. Once all the brackets were glued in place and dried, I went over them with a black marker to improve their appearance. They didn't really work too badly, despite being only paper. One more glazing piece was required for the entry extension which goes onto the end of the box. This one actually had more of a border available than some others. This was actually where I hit the most difficulties. I found it very hard to get this end porch piece attached to the main building properly. It isn't formed very firmly, and there are no tabs or similar to help get it in place. I struggled to keep it square and attach it to the main building in a way that looked sensible. The most obvious problem seen here is that the roof ended up cockeyed and too low to match the printing on the main wall. Next, barge boards for the ends of the roofs are made up by cutting pieces of card to shape and gluing them to the back of the main barge board parts. This was a little less sophisticated than the way Metcalfe do it with heavy card strips, but it worked quite well. The barge boards so prepared went into place on the ends of the roofs without a problem. What was a bit of a problem was the gutters glued onto the bottom edges of the roof. These were made of paper and really quite difficult to shape sensibly and fix in place. Being paper rather than card, the gutters don't have any really rigid form and tend to flap about. The ridge tiles for the top of the roof work quite well. I did use a marker to finish off their colouring at the edges and the fold before fitting them in place. In general on signal box kits, and I've built quite a few signal boxes, the steps to the entrance present one of the major problems. Some kits, such as the ratio plastic Midland signal box, which I built in Engage, make this ludicrously difficult, expecting you to glue tiny individual steps in place with no real help or guidance. The Metcalfe signal box kits use individual card steps, but help you to get a good result by providing an assembly jig. This Superquick got around the whole issue by including moulded styrene parts for the steps themselves and the side railing. The stairway was cast as a single part, so the only assembly required was to glue the railing to the stairway using poly cement. Then the finished stairway was glued onto the model. The signal box is almost complete now. The chimney stack seen at back left here was made of folded paper, which I did not like, as it made it hard to get a square assembly that would stay rigid as you glued it into place on the model. The chimney pot was formed by rolling, somewhat similarly to how Metcalfe do their chimney pots. Metcalfe used thin paper. They actually print the pots onto the instruction sheet, which makes sense since the pots have to be rolled. The pots in this kit were paper, but thicker than with Metcalfe, so it was hard to roll. The instructions suggested wetting the paper to help with rolling. I did this, but then I found that the printed colour was coming away on my fingers as I tried to roll the pots. I managed to get some sort of chimney pot, but it was definitely a struggle. No attempt is made to create a railing round the platform, though I'm pretty sure there really should be one. I suppose it would be difficult to produce anything fine enough using card or paper. Here you can see how the chimney stack goes through the roof. It didn't come out too badly despite being made of paper. I'm afraid my botched job of attaching the entry porch is rather evident here. A tendency for the parts to warp and for things not to go together flat and square was something of a general problem with this kit. This can be even worse with some of the very cheap and basic card kits. On the other hand, Metcalfe generally avoid it very well, making use of rigid, heavy card supports where needed. In this case, I was particularly unhappy that the base of the building wasn't really flat. and I tried to get around this by gluing some heavy card left over from a Metcalf kit to the bottom of the model. This of course raised the whole thing up a bit, but it did make it sit flat much better. Next I moved on to the other smaller buildings included in this kit. Here glazing pieces for the coal office are glued into place on the walls. Again, as you can see, I've left extra acetate on the right-hand window piece, but I was unable to do so on the left-hand piece, so I had to live with the narrow borders provided. The problem is that if you put more than the tiniest spot of glue onto such a narrow border, when you press the acetate onto the card wall, the glue will tend to spread and get onto the visible part of the window. If the borders were made just 2 or 3 times as wide, this problem would be avoided entirely. Anyway, here is that wall with its glazing in place. Behind can be seen the red card former around which the walls will fold. And here is the basic building folded up. Being small, warping is less of a problem here. Next, a ridge beam is folded and glued across the tops of the end walls. This is one of the paper gutters. These things are frankly a real pain. Whatever you do with them, they're not really going to hold well to the form they should take, paper parts again. The coal office gets a base and an entry porch with a doorstep. This is the roof for the coal office porch. As you can see, the printed colouring has not been aligned properly with the stamping out of the part. My first thought was just to cut off the part that was clearly the wrong colour. But then I realised if I did that it would make the part too narrow to fit over the porch, so I just blackened over the wrongly coloured part with a pencil. And here it is in place on the porch, also with pieces of paper guttering at its bottom. These are the ridge tiles for the roof being finished off with a brown marker. Here the ridge tiles are glued in place on the porch roof, and the tiles for the main roof are at bottom left. And now the main roof is in place with gutters and ridge tiles. A chimney stack goes onto the end of the coal office. This was even harder to do than the chimney stack for the signal box, as it's just a piece of folded paper, and there's really nothing to support it and keep it square fitted onto the side of the building as it is. Another chimney pot had to be rolled for the top as well, of course. And the finishing touch to the coal office is a sign on the roof. So that's the coal office building completed. It doesn't look too bad. The downspouts printed onto the walls, lining up with the drain on the base, look quite good from a little distance. The kit also included a couple of little line-side huts. These were very basic, just walls folded round a base former with a flat roof glued on top. 2 coal staiths were provided to go with the coal office. These were supposed to be made by folding and gluing paper inner parts into card outer walls. The paper parts, when folded, did not at all fit into the folded card walls, sticking up over the top, sticking out from the ends, and being too wide for the inner wall. All of the paper walls had to be trimmed down with a sharp knife to get them to fit. Here are the finished huts and staiths. Once the paper parts were trimmed down, the staves went together okay, but since the floors are only paper, they're rather weak. And here are the finished main buildings. I wanted to put coal into the staves. They look a bit pointless without it, but I was rather nervous given that the floors of the staves were only made of paper. I used some fine real coal that I had on hand. I wetted the coal with alcohol using a pipette and then used another pipette to apply scenic cement. Of course, this resulted in the card and paper staiths becoming rather soaked. I put them on a piece of plastic and used a small steel ruler and some lead weights to hold the floors flat whilst the glue dried. Here's the signal box in place on the layout. Here with the passenger train going by. Sorry, a bit out of focus. My camera has a mind of its own and auto-focuses on what it pleases. I will integrate the base of the box better, but I'm still in the mode now of getting as many basic things into place on the layout as possible without worrying too much about the fine detailing and integration. Here's the coal office with the staiths after they've had some time to dry. I put these onto the layout. Again, finishing of the ground around them is clearly required for proper integration, assuming I decide to actually keep them in this place. Currently they're on the entry road by the inner station yard, and the signal box is by the level crossing, just before the points for the passing siding. So there you are, my first Superquick kit build. Overall thoughts? Don't like the glazing much, not that well printed, and borders much too small, making gluing a problem. Don't like the use of paper parts for things like brackets and chimney stacks. There were a few problems with sizing of parts and alignment of printing. On the other hand, much of the printing of parts is well done and makes a good effect, and I was impressed by the inclusion of a moulded stairway, and quite well moulded at that. Would I buy another Superquick kit? Yes, in fact I already have another one on order, the Swan Inn. Would I abandon Metcalfe kits for Superquick? No. The Metcalfe kits provide plenty to justify their higher prices, and I'd continue to look mainly to Metcalfe for card kits. But it's nice to have some additional options.